Hello guys and welcome back to HJW Gaming, and after a long delay I'm finally back with another Age of Empires mobile video, this time taking a look at warrior pikemen. Now this video is going to be primarily based around free to play, particularly for the early game. If you're looking for a spender version, that will come later on down the line. It will be released within the next week or so of this video, so keep an eye out and hit the sub button if you want to get a notification for when that is released. But for the free to play players, this should be very, very useful. Now, I won't waste any more time, I'll get straight on into our commander. And the commander we're going to look to use for the free-to-play warrior pikemen is going to be Richard I. Richard I is a beneficial hero for free-to-play players as he is available on the spin wheel. Now, of course, this can also be very useful for spend players, but the reason this is so great for free-to-play players is you can save up your Empire coins and then spend those by opening multiple spins of the Legendary Advent. So, for example, it's 1,680 Empire coins here for me to make 5 spins, and you can also earn some of the spin tokens as well. So if you go into the spin wheel, if you open 20 of these, you get a guaranteed, if I move out the way, guaranteed open and getting of Richard II medal. You get 10 medals for opening 20 times. So if you save up your Empire coins, Richard I can be available very, very easy for free-to-play players, and he does reappear on the Advent wheel regularly, so you can get his rank up very, very easily. Now, Richard I is a fairly interesting commander when you compare him against all the other formation videos I've done so far, and that particularly relates to how his skills interact compared to a lot of the others. We've seen a lot of our other formations use secondary strike skills, for example, to trigger a lot of damage after they've after they've dealt normal attacks, for example. Whereas with King Richard, it's something a little bit different. It's particularly focused around actually his signature skill rather than his commander skill. So we'll start with that. His signature skill, Lionheart, is particularly interesting as every time your troop is hit, so it's not about normal attacks that you deal, it's about how many times you're hit by the opponent. So when you get hit by a normal attack, you get 1 stack of Mark of the Lionheart. You can get up to 2 stacks per second, so these can stack fairly quickly, and after reaching 20 stacks you deal 1 instance of might damage to the enemy troop, and this is a fairly high instance of might damage. You'll see I've only got this skill at level 10 and it's almost at 200% damage already, so that can be scaled to quite a high amount of counter-attack damage. So he almost receives damage and then does 1 massive burst of damage after that defined amount of time. So if it's 2 stacks per second, that would be around 10 seconds worth of time. So yeah, after a couple of turns basically he'll do this enormous burst of damage, and on top of that, when that's done, you lose all your stacks and you start regenerating that again, ready for another burst of damage, which obviously didn't really need to be said. But on top of that, you also increase Richard's might by a set amount every time your troop loses a percentage of units, up to a maximum of 50%, but this damage buff can be fairly large as again, as I said, I'm only at level 10 on this skill and it's already at 0.75, so if you think you times that by 50, that's an enormous amount of might bonus that can be given. So he'll become a lot stronger as the battle progresses, because as you take more and more damage, his might will be increased, and if you get that high might increase buff coming alongside when he does this burst wave of might damage when his Mark of Lionhearts hit 20, you'll get a huge burst of damage, but that will come late into the fight. His commander skill is Surmount, and this synergizes similarly with those Marks of the Lionheart. It deals might damage for up to 3 nearby enemy troops, and again it's a very high amount of damage here, at nearly 300% at only level 25 skill. And it increases its damage based on the current numbers of Mark of the Lionheart. Now this synergizes particularly well with the signature skill, as each Mark of the Lionheart increases this skill's damage by 10% up to a maximum of 100%. So there is going to be an element of randomness with this, as of course if you've just triggered your signature skill Lionheart, you will have 0 stacks, or if it's triggered fairly recently, between 0 and 10, you won't be getting the maximum buff from this. But if you're between 10 and of course 19 stacks, you will therefore get that kind of maximum 100% boost to this damage, and you'll have a massive wave of damage coming via this commander skill. But there is a degree of randomness, of course, around this, as you can't dictate when those marks of the Lionheart stack. They're instead dictated by when your troops are hit by the opponents. But around, basically what this means, of course, 10 to 19 maximum damage, 0 to 9 not maximum damage. So it basically means around 50% of the time, usually, you're going to be dealing that max amount of damage. The rage cost is 250. So whilst it is a relatively randomness amount, you can guarantee you basically want to take this as it's about on average a 50% increase to the damage number dictated above, which again means that this commander skill deals a huge amount of damage when that kind of counter attack is surging and about to happen. So whilst that's quite an interesting mechanic and something very different from what we've seen before, it is actually incredibly effective in game. You do get enormous burst waves of damage, and actually counters against a lot of the formations that we've dictated previously, even those that counter against pikemen, being of course swordsmen, where they have so many instances of damage with their normal attacks to try and trigger their secondary strike skills. Of course, all of those secondary strikes, you think about when they're doing lots of instances of normal attacks, maybe even using double attack to try and trigger their secondary strikes. Every time they do that, they're increasing your marks of the Lionheart, which again gives you a twofold advantage in that Lionheart's going to activate more often, but also you're going to have more stacks more often for the trigger of Surmount, which is pretty crazy when you think that, you know, a swordsman could counter off against a pikeman, but actually, skill-wise, the pikeman's counter-attacking skills almost counter back on the swordsman, so you could still get a fantastic result. Hopefully I've explained that relatively, it's quite a complex mechanic, so hopefully I've explained that relatively clearly. If you have any questions on any of this, of course, put it down in the comments. Now, for King Richard's epic optional skills, he comes with 2 counter-attacking skills, the first of which is actually called counter-attack, and it means that when you get hit by a normal attack, there is a 15% chance to immediately deal a counter-attack. Now, this is very, very interesting. Similar to, of course, his signature skill, this is the ability to deal damage outside of your own turn. Because during your opponent's turn, while they're dealing damage to you, you could trigger these counter-attacks and therefore inflict damage back on them, which is very interesting and something we don't see in any of the other formations. So yeah, you get that 15% chance to immediately counter-attack, dealing might damage to the attacker. Currently my scaling at level 1 is 27%, but of course that goes up as you level up the skill as well as upgrade the skill as well. Yeah, and you get up to 1 counter-attack per second of that amount of damage. His second epic skill is Vigilance, which is very, very similar. 15% chance to immediately counter-attack, 1 per second, once again, dealing might damage to the attacker. Now, this also has a 50% chance to inflict the rout effect, meaning you deal a little amount of might damage every second, 7% for 3 seconds. So when this triggers, it will actually deal more damage, of course, overall than counter-attack. However, that 50% activation rate makes it a little inconsistent, and in my opinion, counter-attack is just the slightly more consistent version. So that's the epic skill we're going to look to keep. I will only recommend 1 legendary skill, as this is focused mainly around free-to-play. So Vigilance will be the one that we look to replace. But which legendary skill would I look to replace it with? Now, in my opinion, I would write off Tenacity pretty much straight away. It's a unit recovery skill, and it doesn't synergize at all with Richard's commander build, so we can write that one off. Similar with Whirlwind Sweep, whilst it could be useful, it increases your hero's might damage by a percentage once every 6 seconds, so every 2 turns, for up to 5 stacks. Could be useful for dealing more damage, but overall not that synergistic. So that leaves us with Fearless Retribution and Forceful Retaliation. Both of these synergize very, very well and are very similar to Vigilance in a way, but almost like an upgraded version. Fearless Retribution, again, is a counter-attack skill. It has a higher activation chance if I move my head. 20% activation chance there. So it's better because you're more likely to get that counter-attack. 1 in 5 you're going to hit that counter-attack. But the damage rate is also higher. 24.24% at my current level. And again, 1 counter-attack per second being the limit. But on top of that, you also get a troop recovery bonus as well, healing some of your troops. Very minor kind of extra skill, but still could be useful. But in my opinion, I think Forceful Retaliation is better, because in a way this is almost exactly the same skill as Fearless Retribution, except it deals slightly more might damage at 26%, so at my current level about 2% more, but also you increase your hero's might for 6 seconds, so for 2 turns you will get increased might, which of course will then mean you deal more damage in all of your other skills, not just this one. You know, your counter attack will deal more damage, your signature skill will do more damage, your commander skill will do more damage, as he is a might-based hero, which I haven't actually mentioned yet. He is a might-based hero. So, of course, I think I would replace Vigilance here. I would replace that with Forceful Retaliation, as I think it just synergizes that little bit better with the rest of his counter-attacking skills. His rankings also can come into benefit Richard in particular. His rank 1 is quite useful. It increases the damage rate of Lionheart's counterattack by 50%, so it's basically a flat 50% damage buff on that skill, of course, not on him overall, as it doesn't affect his other skills. But yeah, a very good buff here at respect 1 or rank 1. I would particularly aim for getting this for free-to-play players, as I think it's very achievable, obviously with limited spend available, therefore, or no spend available. Rank 1 should be the minimum you look to achieve. So rank 3 is a pretty sizable buff. The first thing you'll note is that the Lionheart's counterattack damage triggers at 16 marks rather than 20. So that's a flat kind of increase in damage for him, because Lionheart will trigger so many more times. Of course, there's basically a 20% increase in the number of times it will trigger, so that's a great buff here. But you would think that potentially you're going to ruin the damage of his commander skill Surmount, as of course you're going to be at that maximum damage amount of between 10 and 19 triggers less often, if you're instead only got the range of 10 to 15 because of that drop off in the number of activations. Of course, at 16 the damage will hit, so you've only got between 10 and 15. But that's somewhat negated by the second effect of this skill, which is that Surmount, instead, that damage increases by 12.5% rather than 10%. So if we look at Surmount, it basically means that every trigger will do 12.5 rather than 10% towards that maximum of 100. So rather than taking 10 stacks to get to the max, it's instead 8. So still 50% of the time, you're going to be at that maximum amount. So essentially this works out as a flat 20% increase to the number of times that Lionheart triggers. So this is a great thing to aim for as you progress through your season. I'm not even going to talk through the rank 5 here, as it's pretty unobtainable for free-to-play players, which this video is aimed at. But yeah, overall, you can see kind of where we're going with this here, in that Richard is a counter-attacking hero designed to soak up damage and then inflict it back upon the opponent within their own turns, particularly late in the battle, where his signature skill, of course, increases that might damage as he loses every 1% of his troops. So in the late game, he's going to deal a huge amount of damage. So, for example, you could in some battles have it where you're falling behind at the beginning, and then you see yourself come back into it and eventually win as that might damage comes into effect later on in the fight. I think that's a really interesting mechanic. And our first look at counter-attacking hero. So yeah, Richard I is going to be our first commander. So now we're going to take a look at second in command, and who are we going to look to pick up? Of course, we're going to look for another warrior pikeman to synergize well with Richard, and the one we're going to look at is actually Joan of Arc. Now, Joan of Arc, as I said, is another warrior pikeman. If we look into her signature skill, once again, she is focused around counterattacks, similar to Richard I. It's a very, very simple skill, working actually very similarly to some of the optional skills possessed by Richard. So when you're hit by a normal attack, there is a 20%, once again, chance to have a counterattack, dealing might damage to the enemy attacker, though it should be said that the percentage might damage is a lot higher than those Richard I optional skills. And again, you're limited to 1 counterattack per second. So it's a very, very simple skill, but actually it can deal quite a large amount of damage if you're getting a counterattack every single turn. Of course, it depends how often Joan of Arc is hit by the opponents, so it's not always going to trigger, but if you're triggering these very, very often, you can actually stack up to get a pretty large amount of damage, particularly for a free-to-play hero. Of course, Joan of Arc is one of the first heroes you get available in the game, so she is very, very available for almost every player, so you should be able to get this formation up and running very early in your season. There's not really a lot more that needs to be said here. Very, very simple skill, so I'll just kind of brush on and go on to her optional skills. Now, her optional skills, we once again see Vigilance, a skill that was familiar, of course, with Richard I, of course, coming up again. And then we also have second skill, which is Metal, so that's somewhat different. But it still works with a very similar mechanic to the counterattacks. After 12 normal attacks taken by your troop, up to 2 per second being counted, you recover a large amount of units. So rather than being a counterattack, you instead take a lot of damage and then use that to get your troops back. Of course, of the two, we like Vigilance as it's similarly counterattack damage. Instead, we're going to look to replace Metal. And which skill are we going to replace that with? There's quite a few different options available, but of these, we're actually going to look into Fearless Retribution. I'm not going to talk through this skill too much, as of course this is exactly the same skill basically that I mentioned with Richard I. The only difference is, of course, there isn't the might-based version that Richard has, so we're going to take this as the next best option. You get that little bit of troop recovery, but the main thing being that 20% chance of dealing a counter-attack for an amount of might damage. We spoke of Richard I, why Tenacity is not that great. Righteous Judgment is just a might-based damage skill, but doesn't synergise particularly well with the Pikemen. Similarly, so is King's Blade, which is a flat might amount. And as we're looking to use counter-attacks, we're going to take Fearless Retribution as her best counter-attacking optional skill. As far as ranks go for Joan of Arc, as she is available in the tavern, you can look to push her rank as high as possible if you are using her in your pikeman formation. All of them are relatively beneficial. Her rank 1 gives a flat counter-attack damage buff by 5%, as does her rank 3 gives an additional 5% again. And then her rank 5 increases the activation chance by 4%. So you just increase the chance of that counterattack. So each of these is a pretty flat damage buff to those counterattacks. So Joan of Arc comes in very synergistic with Richard I. Again, just counterattack, 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 and dealing massive damage in your opponent's turn. Now, who do we put third in command as free to play? This is where things get a little bit sticky. If you have no other option, you can of course use epic heroes with Wu Wei, who at least will give you that troop bonus through being a warrior pikeman. So if you're absolutely desperate, you can use him. But alternatively, there is also Darius the Great. Now, Darius doesn't really synergize at all here. You'll see his signature skill is focused more around increasing his own attributes. So it increases the hero's all attributes by an amount, and when dealing damage, there's a chance to ignore enemy defense. So basically he's buffing his own damage, but there's no synergy here with counterattacks. And we see the same in his optional skills. He begins with Efficient Harvest, which is a gathering skill, so it can be written off almost immediately for PvP. And he also has Sunder, which is a signature strike skill rather than the usual passive counterattack. Just means that you deal damage and inflict the rout effect. If we look at all his other skills, almost none of them again are counterattack related. Another gathering buff with Supplies Transformation. Spirited Pursuit is another secondary strike skill for dealing damage. Road to Victory again, secondary strike damage skill, as similarly with Weak Spot Attack. So nothing counterattack related. So you can see where I'm kind of going with here. Darius the Great is kind of going in just as the best of a bad bunch to be the kind of third commander in this formation for early game. There will, of course, be a replacement to him coming in the future when Boudica becomes available, but for now, Darius the Great early game is the best available, so you should stick him in. However, I would recommend making no effort at all to invest in him, as he doesn't synergise with this formation. Focus more on getting Joan of Arc and Richard I, getting them respect or their ranks up so that you can increase their damage, and Darius the Great can kind of tag on, just giving a little bit of a boost to the rest. He is another tavern hero, so you'll kind of passively get his tokens anyway as you're looking for Joan of Arcs. But yeah, I wouldn't recommend making any particular effort to get Darius the Great. Definitely don't spend your universal medals on him. I'd recommend all universal medals being put on Richard I, particularly up until you get him to rank 3 at the minimum. Now, there is kind of one other option, however it does require you to plan pretty heavily, and that is Frederick Barbarossa. Now, I imagine a lot of you are absolutely screaming at me saying, Frederick Barbarossa's behind a paywall, you can't use him in a free-to-play formation. There is actually a way for free-to-play players to get him outside of the usual methods. Now, usually Frederick Barbarossa is locked behind various different events such as the Daily Special, so you won't be able to get him as a free-to-play player. However, on the same spin wheel as Richard, if you save up your Empire coins significantly. And by significantly, I mean you're going to need, I think, around 50,000 Empire coins. So you will be saving up for a while. So just to be clear, this is not particularly relevant to early game. You'll want to be looking at Darius for that. But as you progress, you could look to pick up Frederick Barbarossa. The way you can do that is actually by just spinning the Richard wheel a ton of times in order to try and get Richard's respect. And why does that help? Well, if I move out the way, you have the pity timer along the bottom here. And actually, when you pick up medals for Richard, you do pick up medals for other heroes. So you'll see this 120 one here is Joan of Arc. 200 here is actually just Richard. Same with the others. But actually, the 60 open chest gives you 10 medals for Richard and 10 medals for Frederick Barbarossa. So you could look to pick up Barbarossa this way if you're desperate to make your free-to-play formation work, save up those Empire coins and get him into this formation. You can then spend universal medals in order to get up his rank. And it should be said that he does synergize significantly better than Darius. He's still not the perfect commander of this formation, and that does come at quite a cost of 50,000 Empire coins. So make sure you've considered this thoroughly if you're going to proceed and try and take this method. But he does synergize with these commanders the first two commanders, much better than Darius, who had no synergy whatsoever. His signature skill, Pledge of Victory in particular, reduces your troops' damage by a percentage when your units fall below 50%. So again, we're looking at that 50% mark where Richard starts to deal massive damage. You actually start receiving significantly less damage due to this reduced damage taken. You also start to get a troop recovery as well. So once you get below 50% troops, you'll start dealing a lot more damage and taking, dealing more damage from Richard, but taking a lot less damage due to this skill from Frederick Barbarossa. So those two synergize as they activate at very, very similar times. As for epic optional skills, he does also have metal, very similar to Joan of Arc, with that unit recovery. As we're using Frederick Barbarossa primarily as the kind of support commander for this formation and not looking into damage, actually this skill looks a lot better than it did for Joan of Arc, who has that very high might stat and is primarily focused on dealing damage. The other epic skill you start with is War Drums, and every 9 seconds increases your hero's armor and strategy by an amount for 3 seconds. Now this isn't particularly great as your other commanders aren't strategy commanders, so that's almost pointless, and increasing their armor will make them receive a little bit less damage but isn't particularly synergistic. So we're going to look to replace War Drums first off, and the skill we're going to look to replace it with is Peaceful Haven. Now this synergizes very well with his signature skill, so it's very good to get in as soon as you get Frederick Barbarossa, as after your hero recovers units, reduces your troops' damage by, so in my case at level 1, 4%. Of course you can scale this up massively with upgrades and spending some points leveling up this skill. So synergizes well with that unit recovery coming from his signature skill, as well as the recovery as well coming from the epic skill Metal. So you can use these two together to synergize in that third commander slot and get great support by reducing the damage taken by the rest of your formation, as well as getting you get a little bit of healing and recovery as well, and again then you further reduce that damage taken once again. So that gives Frederick Barbarossa probably the preferential spot in that third commander slot, or third in command for this formation, but only if you're willing to spend. For other spenders, obviously this will become much easier to get, but at free to play you really have to consider whether you have enough free spins or Empire coins to get to that 60 mark, as it is quite expensive. Anyway, with that, that's everything I had to offer on this formation. Hopefully you found this useful. Of course, there will be a little bit more to talk through when I get onto the spender version of this formation, as those two other heroes I mentioned down here suddenly become open and available to us. And I will also talk through, so for those of you who are halfway in between spender and free to play, that kind of low spend level, I will recommend for those as well. So of course options to replace Darius in particular for that spender formation, but that'll be coming in the next video coming up. So make sure to hit that subscribe button to see when that comes up, and if you found this useful for your Pikemen formation, smash the like button, as I really appreciate it and it really helps to push my content out there. Anyway, with that, I've been HJW Gaming, and I really hope to see you on the next one.